first Douglas DC-3 airliner was put into service in Chicago, Illinois in 1935. By 1940, airline travel in the U.S. was revolutionized, and the DC-3 started its legendary reputation as the airplane that changed the world. The following 1940 film shows why the DC-3 was so successful.
And here is the Manhattan, Flight 12 for Detroit, Buffalo, and New York, now loading. It is one of a great many flights a day to New York on American Airlines. Flagships are air-conditioned before departure. Cool air in summer, warm air in winter. The airmail and air express go up front in the nose of the ship and in the large rear compartment. Baggage goes in these compartments too. 40 pounds carried free for each passenger, more than enough for most travelers.
American Airlines Flight 12, via Manhattan for Detroit, Buffalo, New York. Now loading at gate 5.
Last but not least, the passengers themselves go aboard the ship, giving their names to the stewardess, who greets them with a friendly smile and checks them off on her passenger list. All aboard. The door is closed. The signal to depart is given. The captain presses the button that starts the motors. The first officer is talking to the traffic control tower through his radio phone. The ship taxis out to the far end of the runway and heads about into the wind. A plane always takes off or lands into the wind. The captain checks his motors, first one, then the other. The first officer gets his all-clear go-ahead signal from the airport traffic control tower, and the great flagship moves forward.
Be back soon.
Isn't it beautiful?
I've heard folks say it's one of the most beautiful shorelines in the world. You can really appreciate it from the air.
The nation's capital at Washington, one of America's more inspiring sights. It's scenes like these that give you a new perspective of the earth, a new conception and appreciation of America. Here's Boston Common, so called because in early Boston, it was the common pasture land where any family could graze its cow.
The ground stations at regular intervals as we go along, and to other planes and...
Well, there it is, honey. What did I tell you? Marry me and I'd show you Niagara Falls.
I've seen it 12 times and I ordered it.
The captain obligingly flies a wide circle about the falls to give all his passengers a full and perfect view. Niagara Falls may be seen from the air only on Americans' routes between Chicago and New York. When he thinks of transportation, he thinks in terms of airlines. And many others benefit too. Vacations are extended. More time spent there, less time getting there and back.
At the outbreak of World War II, the DC-3 was reconfigured for war service. The military named the reconfigured version the C-47. In the early morning of June 6, 1944, thousands of soldiers, sailors, and airmen from the United States, Great Britain, and the British Commonwealth readied themselves for D-Day of Operation Overlord, the designated day for the invasion of France and the liberation of Western Europe from their Nazi occupiers. As dawn broke, thousands of soldiers hit 5 beaches along the Normandy coast, and the protective fire of British and American warships and overwhelming air power. Despite this protective umbrella, the fighting was hard and costly before the battle was won. For several divisions of American and British soldiers, the invasion had actually begun the night before. That evening, 18,000 men of the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne Division loaded up into their transports, each marked with large black and white invasion stripe around the wings and fuselages, in anticipation of a daring aerial assault behind German lines in the hope of cutting off Nazi reinforcements from reaching the Normandy beachheads. Their targets were bridges, intersections, and other strategic targets. The Americans dropped behind Utah Beach in support of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division in the Cotentin Peninsula, while the British jumped behind Sword Beach to protect the Allied left flank, silencing a German coastal battery and destroying bridges across the Dives River. By the end of the first full day of combat, more than 23,000 paratroopers had landed by parachute or gliders, most of them carried to war by one single aircraft type, the Douglas C-47. Affectionately known as the Goonie Bird, the C-47 was the primary military transport of the Allies during the Second World War. More than 10,000 were built, with most serving with the Army Air Forces as the C-47 Skytrain. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower thought it one of the most significant military assets responsible for the Allies' victory. After World War II ended in 1945, the city of Berlin, Germany, was surrounded by Russian-occupied Eastern Germany. Berlin was split into 4 zones, occupied by French, British, United States, and Russian troops. Russia was determined to occupy Berlin alone and blocked entrance, cutting off all supplies. The result was the infamous Berlin Airlift.
The Berlin Airlift, the biggest airlift in history. Dateline Germany, 1948. Hoping to drive his Western adversaries out of Berlin, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin orders his troops to cut off all access to the city. Blocked by land and sea, the Allies respond from the sky with the most massive airlift in history. On June 26, 1948, a fleet of U.S. Air Force C-47s carries 80 tons of food into Berlin. This landmark airlift is but the first of what will become a mammoth mission of mercy.
They airlifted cargo to keep the population alive, to give the population resources, energy. 2/3 of all the cargo that was brought over was coal because the Soviets had shut off the electricity supply to the western parts of the city. Obviously, during the winter, this was a particular problem.
The operation is soon joined by the U.S. Navy and the British Royal Air Force. With these added reinforcements, Operation Vittles kicks into high gear. On Easter Sunday, April 16, 1949, the Allies organize the Easter Parade, an airlift that will be the dramatic climax of Operation Vittles. Over a frenetic 24-hour period, American and British planes touch down and lift off every 30 seconds. The Allies deliver an astounding 12,940 tons of cargo, including enough coal to fill 1,100 rail cars.
The scale was completely unprecedented in the history of military operations.
The Easter airlift is a crushing blow to the Soviet blockade, rendering the operation futile. In the face of Western resolve, the Soviet Union officially ends the blockade on May 12, 1949. The final tally of the airlift is astonishing. Operation Vittles lasted an incredible 15 months, from June of 1948 to September of 1949. By the end, American and British pilots had flown 92 million miles on 277,000 flights, delivering nearly 2.3 million tons of supplies. Simply put, the biggest airlift in history.
Now I would like to explain my keen interest in the C-47 that led me to make this video. It began in 1954 when I joined the U.S. Army to become a paratrooper. At that time, the C-47 was still in use as a transport airplane for paratroopers. In early 1955, I traveled to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where I was to receive airborne training and would jump from the famous C-47 aircraft. We received 2 months of intense training before initiating our first jump, and then we jumped several additional times before earning our airborne badge. After serving a stint of military service in the 4th Infantry Division in Germany, I was transferred to the 6th Infantry Regiment in Berlin, Germany, where I spent a year and a half doing patrol and other duties in the city of Berlin. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Betsy's Biscuit bomber, a very special C-47 that flew many missions in the European campaigns of World War II. Betsy also participated in the Berlin Airlift that you just watched. In June of 2019, over 30 C-47s came together to reenact the Normandy invasion. What may well prove to be the last such reenactment. One of these aircraft was Betsy's Biscuit bomber, a Dakota C-47. It is configured for a crew of 2 and can carry 28 paratroopers. It has a wingspan of 95 feet and an empty weight of 16,865 pounds and a fuel capacity of 822 gallons. Join me now as Betsy flies to Europe for the reenactment.
In 2017, the crew of Betsy's Biscuit bomber undertook the daunting task of flying their 1944 war veteran C-47 across the Atlantic to be involved in the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the D-Day invasion and the 70th anniversary of the Berlin Airlift. Preparations included extensive work to the airframe, a new engine, and a new avionics package. After 18 months of hard work, the airplane departed Paso Robles with stops in Chino, California, Wichita, Kansas, Frederick, Maryland, and Oxford, Connecticut. Highlights of the Continental Crossing included a flyover of the Pentagon and Arlington National Cemetery as part of a 5-ship formation of C-47s, and a flight of 9 C-47s flying down the Hudson River and circling the Statue of Liberty. Presque Isle, Maine was the jumping-off point for the Atlantic Crossing, which included stops in Goose Bay, Canada, the former Sonderstrom Air Base in Greenland, Reykjavik, Iceland, and Prestwick, Scotland. before arriving at Duxford Aerodrome, just outside of Cambridge. Betsy's Biscuit bomber joined up with 24 other C-47s in England to provide an enthusiastic English crowd with large Dakota formation displays and an authentic backdrop for reenactors to load up and fly simulated jump missions. Betsy and her crew then crossed the Channel into France to continue the commemoration with reenactment paratrooper drops on historic drop zones in the French countryside, as well as flights over the American National Cemetery in Normandy and Utah and Omaha Beach. On June 6th, Betsy's Biscuit bomber was in the number 5 position of a 14-ship C-47 formation flight over the cemetery and Presidents Trump and Macron. After dropping more than 100 round parachute jumpers, the crew and airplane moved on to Germany and the Wiesbaden U.S. Army Air Base, where they entertained over 40,000 U.S. servicemen and women, their families, and the local community that supports the base. Betsy's Biscuit bomber had the honor of transporting Colonel Gale Halverson, the original Candy bomber, to Berlin, and flew in a mass formation around the city of Berlin in commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the Berlin Airlift. Betsy's Biscuit bomber triumphantly headed home with stops in Kansas to visit Doc and take in some Midwest hospitality before continuing on to Cody, Wyoming to participate in the 4th of July festivities. Some stunning statistics from the trip include a total duration of 2 months and 4 days, total flight time of 150 hours, over 12,000 gallons of 100 low-lead avgas burned, and 200 gallons of W120 engine oil used, flight operations in 7 countries, and experiences of a lifetime for the crew and observers alike. We appreciate the opportunity to share our airplane and its history with the people of England, France, and Germany, and would like to thank the Wild Bill Museum of the West, the Estrella Warbird Museum, and all of our individual supporters for helping us complete this mission.
On April 17, 2021, I was introduced to Betsy's Biscuit bomber in a very personal way. Not only was I able to fly on the famous C-47 that I once jumped from, but I was able to co-pilot, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Join me on the flight of my lifetime. This is my Betsy story. Thanks for joining me on this flight on Betsy's Biscuit bomber. You will get an idea what it's like to experience a flight on one of the most iconic airplanes in aviation history. Estrella Warbirds Museum joined with Goonie Bird Group LLC to offer flights on Betsy's Biscuit bomber, a C-47 that participated in major World War II campaigns and the Berlin Airlift. Today, our flight will take us from Paso Robles, California airport with 14 passengers and 3 crew members to enjoy a flight on the Central Coast. The flight route along the Pacific Ocean will offer views of Hearst Castle, Lake Nacimiento, and the Morro Bay Rock before circling back to the city of San Miguel, where a parade flyover will be performed. 2 former military aircraft, also from the Estrella Museum, joined with Betsy's Biscuit bomber to perform a formation flyover of the parade event. Our pilot today will be Sherm Smoot, and co-pilot will be Scott Stelsley. After pre-flight and warm-up, the airplane is taxied to the runway at Paso Robles for takeoff. After Sherm and Scott have completed the instrument checkout and run-up, the fasten seatbelt sign is turned on and we begin taxi to the runway. If you look to the left, you will see the airplane that will be joining us on the parade flyover later in our flight. Time for takeoff. After completion of the takeoff checklist, the aircraft is aligned with the runway center line and the propeller levels are advanced to full forward and the tail wheel is locked. Takeoff power is set at 48 inches HG and 2,750 RPM. At approximately 50 knots, the tail will come up. At approximately 84 knots, the airplane is in takeoff mode. The pilot gently pulls back on the controls to take off and holds this speed until he gets a positive rate of climb. When the aircraft is showing a positive rate of climb on liftoff, the landing gear is retracted. And at 105 knots, power is reduced to 35 inches manifold pressure and the props reduced to 2,350 RPM. At a safe altitude, airspeed is increased to 115 knots and this speed is maintained while climbing to a cruising altitude. Upon reaching cruising altitude, I was able to take over co-piloting duties from Scott. This was the event of a lifetime, and I was able to do some maneuvers to get a feeling what it was like to fly a twin-engine airplane. Passengers got wind I was the pilot. They began to pray, but then enjoyed the scenery from the airplane. On the left is a magnificent view of Lake Nacimiento. We traveled the full length of this lake, then made a turn back towards San Miguel, where we were joined by two airplanes from Estrella Warbird Museum in order that we could do a flyover of the parade in San Miguel. This was truly an exciting part of the flight. Back corner, and you'll see that the fighter plane is moving out quickly as he's going to land at Paso Robles before us. So now we are in the approach portion of our flight, and we lowered our speed to 105 knots, and we're getting ready to approach. As you cross the threshold at around 50 feet above ground level, the power should be at 15 inches HG and props at 2,050 RPM. Once the tail wheel is on the runway, apply the brakes and exit the runway and taxi to parking. private pilot, I entered my co-piloting duties into my logbook with tremendous pride.